They raised their champagne flutes and laughed like they were sharing a private joke I wasn't invited to. Crystal caught the light. The band swelled. Someone told the groom to smile wider. I stood at the edge of the dance floor in an emerald dress the tailor had argued with me about, the one I had insisted on because my son deserved roses that matched his wife's eyes. 2 hours earlier, I had been adjusting Bradley's bow tie. 2 hours later, my sister looked right at me and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Look at her! Who would ever want to have to put up with that old fat pig?" The words landed and refused to dissolve. There was a beat where the music became background noise, and my life compressed into a single, terrible reflection of myself in a champagne flute. A woman who had paid for every rose, who had negotiated every vendor, who had signed the checks and coaxed the business through recessions so my family could call itself successful. And yet, in front of the people I loved the most, I was reduced to an insult tossed like garbage across a tablecloth. It was my sister who said it, Eleanor, who'd always been sharp-tongued and privately competitive. We had been raised the same, turned out differently by small fortunes and one very large grief. She had come back from a life of insisting appearances mattered more than truths, and in that moment she wanted everyone to be reminded which side of the ledger she thought she belonged on. Whether she meant the words to splinter me or to make herself look smaller by comparison, it no longer mattered. The damage had been done. People laughed before they really knew what they'd heard. Bradley's new wife, my son's bride, covered her mouth and looked horrified and delighted at once, the exact expression of someone who had been taught to thrive on social theater. My sister's husband tried to quiet her, as if the sound might be put back inside like a cork. My hands were steady because I had to keep them steady. I had a glass in one hand and the plastic name card of the table in the other. I remember thinking, with an odd clarity, that the dress I had chosen was not the kind of armor the world recognized any longer. It was a very expensive, impeccably cut costume for a role I had stopped playing for myself years ago. Later, when the band took a break and the chatter regenerated around platefuls of food, someone floated an apology on the surface of the party, clumsy, public, useless. My sister gave me that look people who buy time from others give, to imply regret without paying for it. Bradley avoided my eyes. He laughed too loudly at a joke across the table. The room hummed like someone else's life, and I realized that humiliation had a direction. It always wanted to make you small enough to be overlooked, expendable, a footnote in someone else's story. That was the sting. But beneath the sting was a long memory. Years of paying tuition, of quietly sending money for a down payment, of keeping Bradley afloat while he floundered through job after job that never stuck because he believed deep down there was always someone to catch him. I had loved him so fiercely I mistook doing everything for allowing him to become someone. The cost of that love had been more complicated than I admitted to myself. It was not only money, it was dignity. A small private part of me, older, steadier, took inventory that night instead of breaking. I thought of ledger sheets and board minutes, of dividends, and the way a name on a stock certificate carries authority as absolute as a judge's gavel when the paperwork is tidy. I thought of the long, patient work required to turn a grief into a company you could count on, of how my late husband's handshake and my stubbornness had, over 3 decades, become this thing called Harrison Industries. I had watched the company grow, and I had, quietly and deliberately, built myself a position inside it that no one in that ballroom suspected I held. If humiliation is public theater, power is quiet backstage work. I had learned the backstage movements by necessity, by surviving. I had the paperwork that mattered. I knew the names people used when talking about important things. I knew where signatures lived. In that second of standing stunned by my sister's voice, I felt the old calculation rise up, that if respect was not to be asked for, it could be enforced, not by spectacle, but by institution. Before I go any further, before the idea takes on its full shape, you should know one small thing about what happened next. If this story stirs something in you, if you have ever been dismissed because of where you came from or how you look, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If someone has underestimated you, type the city. I'll be reading. After the soft, useless apologies faded, I retreated to the small alcove by the kitchen where the catering staff kept their coats and dishcloths. It smelled like coffee and lemon sanitizer, a smell I would carry with me for days. I looked at my hands. They had led the company through recession. They had written checks people called generous and foolish in unequal measure. My son had been my single greatest joy and my single largest source of worry. The room spun, not because of champagne, but because the ledger of favors and apologies had finally balanced itself into an account I could no longer ignore. It is an odd thing to be a woman in your 60s who has kept a secret for so long. The secret isn't the goods you hide, but the shape of your own resolve. I had been careful with my money the way someone tends a garden in the shadow of winter, planting, pruning, saving seeds. Long before the wedding, I had turned dividends into additional shares, directed inheritance into voting trust arrangements, and accepted the slow, boring accumulation of power that looks like prudence when no one is watching. Let me be specific in a way that feels almost tedious but is necessary. Controlling interest in a company doesn't happen by gossip or by size of the house. It happens when the numbers on the registry put your name next to 51% of the votes. There are ways to safeguard a family's interest: trusts, voting agreements, cumulative voting, but none of that matters if you own the votes or the people who hold them. For a long time, I had been the quiet owner of the mechanism behind the brand name on our building. I had acquired those shares legitimately over time, through purchases, through reinvestment of dividends, and through shares allotted to me when others didn't claim them. It was not a surprise. It was a slow accretion of responsibility I had accepted because someone had to. My sister did not know. Bradley did not know. Most of our friends did not know. Most importantly, the people who had treated me with a kind of exasperated charity never once read the documents tucked into the manila envelopes in my home office. That night, after everyone left and the lights came up like some crude, merciful sunrise, I took the manila envelope those documents lived in and carried it to my bedroom like something sacred and ordinary at once. Inside were share certificates, statements with my name on them, ballot proxies signed years ago with the care of a woman who preferred writing checks to writing sermons. There were minutes from board meetings where I had been discussed as if I were a generous aunt instead of a stakeholder. There were letters I had written to myself about boundaries I intended to keep, thoughtful, practical notes that read almost like the voice of advice I would want my younger self to accept. I had not planned that evening as a pivot. I had only known that the insult had opened a wound that would not stop bleeding until it was addressed. There was a simpler life I could have chosen. Pay more, apologize more publicly, swallow the words, and let them settle back into the social rubble. That would have been easiest for everyone, but easiest had never been the only path available. I had been given responsibility for the company's employees, for the reputation my husband and I had built, for the community that depended on Harrison Industries to provide jobs and stability. I realized with a cold, bright clarity that allowing my son and my sister to set the terms of public discourse about me undermined more than my feelings. It undermined the dignity of a life's work. So I made a decision. I would not be a spectacle. I would not be theatrical. I would be procedural. I would do what is most dangerous to the entitled. I would be boringly competent. Power is not always visible. Sometimes it's a form signed correctly and filed promptly. Sometimes it's the patient understanding of corporate bylaws and the right to call a special meeting. And I had both. The next morning, while the sun filtered through the blinds and my kitchen still smelled like lemon sanitizer, I called Richard Patterson. Richard had been my attorney for nearly a decade. He had the sort of voice that made you imagine ledgers lined up like soldiers, efficient, no nonsense, with little taste for melodrama. He also had an affection for precise things. He liked templates, precedent, the certainty of paperwork. When I told him what had happened at the wedding, I left out the humiliating details, but I told him I had been publicly diminished. He listened and then asked about the holdings. I told him to come by in the afternoon. I am not a woman who flares publicly. I prefer systems. Richard helped me translate outrage into action. He opened a file and pulled out a notebook and asked the questions a process requires. Was the ownership clear? Were the proxies in place? What did the bylaws say about calling a meeting? Who sat on the board, and how had they been appointed? He explained patiently that there was a way to compel recognition without theatrics, through a formal assertion of control supported by documentation and by the proper legal procedures. He emphasized that we must keep every step defensible in court if anyone tried to call our actions improper. I like that phrase, defensible in court. It meant our plan would be anchored to facts, to record, to the kind of credibility other people ignored at their peril. We spent hours, longer than the wedding itself, going through lists and dates, marking where signatures matched. There was a particular satisfaction to finding order in chaos, a proxy here, a stock certificate there. We drew up a timetable. There would be a call to the chairman, a request for an emergency board meeting, a presentation of the ownership and of proposed changes. We would not use the company's machinery to punish. Rather, we would use it to correct long-standing mismanagement and to make decisions that protected the enterprise and its employees. That was the line I insisted on, and Richard accepted it without dramatics, the line between vindictiveness and governance. Meanwhile, back at home, family life rearranged itself in small, eager-to-heal gestures. Bradley texted sparing apologies that felt like candlelight offered across a canyon. My sister sent a message that read like calculation. Regret, accompanied by an offer to host a brunch. Bradley's bride floated between contrition and defensiveness. She had been raised to be precious in public and robust in private, a combination that made reconciliation slippery. But the work of the next days was not made up of apologies. It was made of phone calls and alliances. I called Robert Chen, a steady, practical member of the board I had known for years. Robert is the kind of person who reads the company's balance sheet like someone else reads a good novel, intensely, with attention to plot twists. He answered his phone in a voice that suggested he had been expecting calls of consequence. I told him bluntly that the family had aired a public embarrassment, and that rather than shout louder into the void, I planned to make certain the company was run to serve employees, not to buoy a social narrative. I told him I would be presenting evidence of my control, and that I wanted him at the emergency board meeting. He asked one question. Do you want to do this quietly, or do you want it to be a signal? Quietly, I said, firmly. And if people accuse you of using it for personal reasons? Then we will show them minutes and motions and the effects on employees' lives. This isn't personal. This is about stewardship. He agreed to attend. I felt the first small, solid click of a lock turning. There were procedural tasks that felt, in their own utilitarian way, like revenge, the kind I could accept. I updated the trust documents to clarify voting rights, ensured that proxies were properly executed, and arranged for a certified share count to be delivered to the board. I asked Richard to prepare a memo on the process for a special meeting and to advise on any potential conflicts of interest. He flagged the family relationships on the signature pages, but reminded me that familial relations do not supersede corporate obligations. The company answers to law and to the board, he said, not to society's gossip. What I did not do was throw my son's life on the fire. That would have been cruel and pointless. I was careful to separate Bradley's parenting failures from anything criminal he had not yet been accused of. Love is not an excuse for enabling, but it is also the reason you act with a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. My plan was to stop paying the invisible bills that let his missteps accumulate without consequence. I would give him the chance to be accountable, to work, to justify his role in the enterprise if he wanted it. I would not give him an unearned title or a payroll without responsibility. That was not punishment. It was the painful medicine of adult life. Yet there was another, quieter conviction gnawing at me. For years I had been the family rescuer, the one to guarantee rent, to co-sign, to sign name after name on loan applications when the bank was unconvinced. Habits die slowly. That night at the wedding had shown me the cost of the habit. Every act of saving had taught my son and my sister to assume a certain latitude with me. It had permitted them to treat me as someone you could humiliate and then expect to reset with a check. I could not do that any longer. One evening in that first week after the wedding, I sat Bradley down across from me in the kitchen. The light over the table was just a chilled bulb, nothing dramatic. He was 31, still handsome in the casual way that comes from being habitually unbothered with a boy's persistence in his jaw. He tried to make a joke about the wedding, and I let it land and die. I reminded him that the company was not a piggy bank. He bristled, then softened, then asked if I was angry. I said, "I'm concerned." He rolled his eyes, and I remember thinking that his reflex to minimize my words was a habit as well. "Mom," he said finally, more weary than flippant, "we can fix this. I can get things in order." "And who will teach you how to get things in order if they keep paying for the mess?" I asked. He looked genuinely startled. He had been living inside a narrative where I would always find the levers. Later that night, after he left, I sat with my papers again and thought about the mechanics of change. The legal route would take a few weeks at most once the board was convened. The social route, the one that would change familial expectations, would take far longer. There was another problem I suspected but had not yet confirmed. A series of odd withdrawals, a set of loan agreements in the company's name, signatures that felt off. I did not want to hunt for evidence out of spite. I wanted to know whether the company's books had been used to underwrite anyone's lifestyle without proper authorization. That, if true, would require a different set of actions: investigation, counsel, perhaps law enforcement if the numbers pointed there. The idea of wrongdoing moving from invisible to visible is a particular kind of moral collapse. You can live with someone's sloth or arrogance when it shows on them alone. You cannot tolerate it if it starts to hollow out the company that hundreds of people rely upon. That would be negligence on my part. I would not be negligent. There were small signs, grainy at first, then sharper. An invoice that seemed double what it should have been. A loan entry with a signature that leaned wrong, like someone hurriedly trained to match a script. An account that paid for an out-of-town apartment for Bradley for months without clear business justification. It was the sort of thing you fail to notice when you have affection for the person who benefits. Once you start looking for patterns, the pattern tends to show up in a way that is embarrassingly inevitable. I told Richard to prepare not only an assertion of control, but to begin the initial steps of an audit. "If there's nothing there," I said, "then let's close this quickly and be done with it. If there is something, we'll keep this legal and clear and protect the company." He agreed and added that we should prepare for pushback from family members who might not like having their behavior scrutinized. He used the word pushback like someone naming a weather condition, expected, manageable if planned for. Word travels fast in families that treat scandal as a kind of theater. Within 48 hours of my call to Richard, my sister's tone changed. The brunch she offered turned into an anxious request for coffee with my oldest friend. My cousin, the treasurer, conservative, a man named Edward, called to ask if everything was all right at the company. He sounded worried, and I suspected, a little more worried about optics than about our employees' pensions. There is a particular disbelief that comes with the idea that the woman in a dress might have teeth. That disbelief often sounds like concern. Meanwhile, I prepared myself for the emergency board meeting. I was meticulous because I wanted to be beyond reproach. I drafted motions with Richard, collected certified statements from our registrar, and ensured the minutes were prepared to document my intention to propose a set of governance changes, a re-evaluation of family contracts, a review of executive compensation tied to performance metrics, a modernization of HR policies, and a rent review that would bring family-occupied properties to fair market values. These were not punitive. They were corrections to poor policy that had allowed a generation of comfortable complacency. We would present them not as fire and brimstone, but as fiduciary responsibility. Sitting in the quiet of my study late at night, I thought about what I was asking of my son. I was not asking him to sink or apologize theatrically. I was asking him to earn his seat, to be accountable, to accept the same consequences any other employee would face if they had mismanaged funds or misrepresented documents. That was a long conversation, but I needed to have it in a way that wouldn't look like the theatrics the family relied on to reset their reputations. I made lists on legal pads. I called Robert to confirm his attendance at the board meeting. I asked Richard to prepare a simple, honest presentation. The focus would be on repair, not revenge. I repeated that phrase in my head like a talisman. There were moments, solitary and wounding, when the temptation to make them feel the sharp edge of humiliation was fierce. I could have held the wedding insult like a banner and marched it through the boardroom. It would have made for a satisfying public spectacle. But satisfaction is a luxury that often hides the truth you have to live with afterward. I wanted consequences that could be explained at a shareholders' meeting and defended in a courtroom if necessary. I wanted change that would outlast an emotional high. I wanted dignity returned in a way that could be measured. Better benefits for employees, transparent contracts, management subject to performance reviews, things that would matter to workers who would never come to the wedding and had no interest in our family drama except in how our decisions affected their paychecks. And yet part of me acknowledged that no amount of corporate governance could close the personal wound without work on both sides. Families don't reconcile because bylaws say so. Respect sometimes requires forgiveness, but forgiveness is earned, and it is not the same as enabling. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived like any other workday for the people who kept the company running. For me, it felt like the moment in a long novel where the protagonist finally decides to correct course. I dressed plainly, something that wouldn't distract or intimidate, because theater wasn't my aim, and I packed the manila envelope as if it were a lunch. The envelope was small, but inside it sat years of careful defensiveness. Registered stock certificates, proxies, a list of holdings verified by our transfer agent. There were also notes I had written to myself about how to present this without rancor. Start with facts, move to governance, finish with a set of actionable recommendations. Bradley called me on the way to the meeting and left a flurry of messages, some pleading, some blasé. He left one that was simple. "Mom, can we talk before you do anything crazy?" There was a tenderness in it that made my stomach twist. I wanted more than anything to tell him that I was not acting to harm him. I was acting to save what we had together in a way that required him to stand on his own feet. But there are conversations that are better had in the sunlight of honesty than in the darkness of negotiation, and this was one of them. I parked a block from the office, took the manila envelope out of my bag, and did what good managers do before making a big presentation. I rehearsed the facts. The walk from the car to the glass doors felt elongated, like the heartbeat before jump. I thought about the staff who would not read the wedding coverage or the social posts. I thought about the people on the factory floor who came in at 5 a.m., who had mortgages and kids, whose lives were the practical metric of whether Harrison Industries functioned properly. Those people were the reason I had decided not to let a single social insult become the reason to collapse an institution. I opened the doors and felt the office air, the smell of coffee, of wood polish, of the hum of people who took care of ordinary mercies. At the reception desk I gave my name. The receptionist smiled, polite and unaware of the current family drama. I walked toward the elevators, the manila envelope heavy and small in my hand, like a secret key. At the elevator I saw Edward, my cousin, the treasurer, coming out of a side meeting. He saw me, and for the first time there was a different look on his face. Not quite fear, not quite defiance, but the beginning of recognition. He nodded. I returned the nod. We did not speak. In the lobby my phone buzzed. A text from Robert. "Here, stay calm." Another text from Richard. "Proposals are on the table. Bring nothing beyond the facts." The receipts for decades of my life lay neatly compressed inside the manila envelope. I walked into the elevator and remembered with a flash that made me smile despite the tension. A small moment long ago, when my husband and I had stood in this same building and marveled at how far a promise could go when you kept it. That memory steadied me. The elevator doors opened onto a floor that smelled of new coffee and paper. The conference room was glassed in on one side, enough to let the city see us if it cared to. Chairs were arranged as if for a meeting that would be candid but concise. I took my place at the head of the table and sat down, smoothing my dress. It was time to present the facts. It was time to show what was in the manila envelope. It was time to begin the work of making respect durable again, through policy, through accountability, and through the steady processes that keep organizations functioning. I set the envelope on the table, fingers flat on its crease, and when the room had quieted and the chair clacked closed at one end, and the chairman took his seat, I opened my mouth. I set the manila envelope on the table because paperwork has a gravity all its own. The room, which had been a low hum of polite expectation, folded into silence. I laid out the certified stock ledger, the transfer agent's printout, the proxies lined up by date, and the photocopies of the minutes where I had been discussed as if I were an anecdote rather than a stakeholder. I did not raise my voice. The facts took up the space I had once allowed gossip to occupy. James Harrison, who had been the president of the company for as long as anyone could remember, watched the documents with a look I had seen on others the year my husband died. The look people wear when the ground shifts under their feet and they are not sure which ruin will be closest to them when it settles. He cleared his throat and said politely that family matters should remain family matters. He suggested, thinly veiled, that perhaps the evening could have been handled differently, as if the hurt that had been inflicted on me could be managed with a note of condolence. I listened. Then I pointed to the transfer agent's certified statement and said quietly that family matters include corporate responsibilities. I said that I had, over time and deliberately, acquired a controlling interest. I explained what controlling interest meant in plain English. More than half of the voting power. I explained that this wasn't about theatrical tit for tat. It was about fiduciary duty, about making sure the company that bore our name honored the people whose lives it supported. Robert Chen, who sat 2 chairs down and who had the blunt, practical face of someone comfortable with numbers, nodded. Edward, my cousin and the treasurer, shuffled a packet of papers and asked a careful question about how proxies had been obtained. There was no triumph in the way I answered. I wanted the meeting to be unimpeachable. Dates, signatures, a clear chain of custody to the documents. Richard made sure everything had been notarized. We had a legal memo describing the procedure for calling a shareholder meeting and for the process of voting. There was no drama, there was method. Once the basic legalities were out of the way, I moved to the reforms. I told the room in the voice I had used to shepherd budgets and labor negotiations that the company would be undergoing a governance review. We would re-evaluate family contracts that had allowed relatives to occupy positions without clear job descriptions or measurable results. We would align executive compensation with metrics tied to profitability and safety. We would update HR policies so that every employee, not just those with family names, was evaluated on transparent criteria. We would commission a rent review of company-owned properties occupied by family members and bring them to fair market value, with a transition plan for those who needed time to adjust. There was a murmur, the kind of stunned sound that precedes either cooperation or resistance. James insisted the changes seemed hasty. Patricia, who was not a board member but who could be heard through a monitored line of family influence, expressed worry about upsetting people. That phrase, used to protect the few at the cost of many, used to sound subtle in our house. It sounded thin in a conference room filled with people who had signed payroll checks for decades. Then I made a deliberate, humane point. These changes were not going to be done to humiliate anyone. They would be implemented with a plan for transition, with assistance and counseling for those who needed help stepping into roles correctly or stepping out if they could not perform to the required standard. We would hire an independent consultant to audit family contracts and make recommendations. We would not, as a matter of policy, give titles or salaries to relatives without job descriptions and performance measures. We would not allow the company's resources to be used to subsidize a lifestyle without justification. That last sentence was the one everyone felt. I had calculated the vote. I had not wanted to rely on it in the same way a swordman wants a blade. I wanted policy that would withstand scrutiny and last beyond my tenure. But when Edward, who had been quiet a long while, looked at the papers and then at the faces around the table and finally said, "I think we should put the motion," I felt the air change. We called a special shareholder meeting. Notices were sent. The registrar confirmed the share count. The motions were printed and attached to the minutes. The mechanics were boring and considered, and that was precisely the point. Within days, we began to make changes that mattered to ordinary people. We increased the paid sick leave policy because there were workers on the floor who came in with a fever because they couldn't afford to miss a shift. We instituted a tuition assistance program for children of long-term employees, something my husband had spoken about in broad terms and that had never been properly funded. We adjusted overtime procedures to ensure compliance with labor law and respect for people's time. We renegotiated supplier contracts where we found weak terms that had been the result of complacency or relationships maintained more for comfort than for cost. We did not rebrand the company or issue a speech designed for the society pages. We presented motions, held votes, and published minutes. The small actions, more secure health benefits, a better 401k match, a clearer grievance process, were the ones that returned dignity in the only currency that mattered for most people: steady pay and a respectful workplace. The family, meanwhile, reacted in the way families do when a new balance emerges, with a scramble to translate old expectations into new terms. Patricia called me to have a quiet word. Eleanor, my sister, who had said the thing at the reception that cracked bone deep, called to ask for a meeting and then canceled twice. Bradley texted, asked if we could talk. His wife, who had appeared both startled and amused the night of the wedding, sent a message that read like a diplomatic communique. Regret, attached to a request for a private conversation. The private conversations were important, but there were other, more urgent matters. The forensic audit Richard had begun at my request surfaced anomalies faster than you'd expect when a pattern is blatant, small sums that didn't add up, a line of credit that had been authorized in the company's name but used to make payments that matched the pattern of a personal lifestyle. Most damning, a separate loan agreement that carried, in the bank's own handwriting and in a hurried, poorly matched signature, my name. I remember that a moment with the forensic accountant, the manila envelope again, this time containing copies of a loan that had been approved with what looked like my signature. The accountant was patient, clinical, a person who treated human error like a puzzle. He had a habit of saying, "Show me the data." And so we did. He brought in a handwriting analyst. He compared my signature to the one on the loan documents. The analysis said the same thing I felt in my bones. The signature had been forged by a hand trying very hard to mimic mine. Who would benefit? I asked. He read off a list of disbursements, payments to an out-of-state apartment lease, wire transfers to an individual's account that matched payments recorded for personal expenses, transfers to a business that served no legitimate corporate purpose. The pattern was clear enough that the only question was how deep it ran. The first person I thought of wasn't my sister. It wasn't bewilderment first. It was a cold, clinical worry for the company. If the company had guaranteed loans or made payments on personal accounts, that could mean liability, potential lawsuits, and worst of all, harm to the people who worked there. My chest tightened with that thought before the personal betrayal washed over me. We called Bradley into the study one evening as the audit unfolded. I wanted to give him the chance to explain before we took steps that would harm him permanently. I did not want to create a theatrics-driven crucible. I wanted facts and an opportunity for him to accept responsibility. He sat opposite me at the kitchen table, his eyes shadowed in a way I hadn't seen since he was small and had scraped his knee. He tried to laugh first, old reflex. Then he folded his hands like a man rehearsing a speech. "It wasn't like this," he said. "I never meant for it to." "Then tell me how to make sense of the transfer to a private lease in Denver that was paid by the corporate account," I said. I kept my voice even. There is a particular advantage in being calm when you are delivering bad news. It focuses the other person's shame into something they can speak past. He flinched. He admitted clumsily that he had been living beyond his means. He admitted he had taken money, small at first, then bigger, rationalizing each step as a temporary fix. He said he had forged my signature on a few loan documents to get approval faster. He said he had thought he'd pay it back. He said he had been terrified of telling me because he knew what my disappointment would look like. When he said he had forged my signature, the room around me shrank into a single point. Forgery is not merely a formality. It is theft by proxy, a betrayal that leverages trust as currency. It is also a crime. I felt anger, but also a strange, awful clarity. Everything I had been doing, building governance, increasing benefits, protecting jobs, helped people who did not have the luxury of a family backstop. My son's theft endangered that trust. I did not scream. I did not throw plates. I had spent a lifetime investing in the scaffolding of a company. I would not let it unravel because of private discretion. I told him plainly that we would involve the lawyers and the police if necessary. But first, we would do a full accounting. We would get him the help he needed. We would demand a written confession and a restitution plan. We would require he step down from any role he held at the company immediately and submit to monitoring and counseling. Those were the conditions I was prepared to offer before the state got involved. If he accepted them and the restitution plan was feasible and he followed it under supervision, we would consider an internal path that prioritized repair over punishment. If he refused, legal remedies would follow. It was not an easy choice. There was compassion in wanting to save your child. There was responsibility in knowing that saving him by hiding what he had done would hurt hundreds of others. I chose responsibility. The process we set up was rigorous. Richard drafted a confession form, precise, unambiguous, detailing the dates, the amounts, and the mechanisms of the forgeries. The confession was meant to be a factual record, not a plea for absolution. We arranged for a restitution schedule, salary garnishment where applicable, liquidating certain assets Bradley had under his name, and restoring funds to the company. Where there were gaps we could not fill immediately, we would seek structured repayment plans. We engaged a third-party trustee to monitor compliance. Bradley would enroll in financial counseling and in therapy for addiction to avoidance, because the pattern that drives this kind of behavior is often deeper than mere laziness. We set up the chicken wire of accountability, not to humiliate him but to ensure he could not slip back into old comforts. There was also a criminal dimension we could not avoid. Forgery and misuse of corporate funds are crimes. Richard advised we discuss the matter with the prosecutor's office, presented the evidence, and asked for guidance on whether the restitution plan could be a basis for a negotiated resolution. The prosecutor said there was discretion in such cases. If restitution were complete and the defendant admitted responsibility and the harm could be measured, a non-prosecution agreement could be considered in certain instances. That was neither promised nor guaranteed, and I said so to Bradley. He would have to be transparent and consistent. He signed the confession with a hand that trembled. He apologized. He said the things you say when you are at the bottom and willing to make any bargain to climb out, that he'd been ashamed, that he had been afraid to ask for help, that he had been convinced the easiest thing was to fake it until it worked. I accepted his apology in the manner one accepts a fragile, tentative peace. Acceptance was not trust. It was the beginning of work. Eleanor, my sister, came to me then, under the guise of family repair. Her visit had the nervous edge of someone who had seen the scaffolding collapse and was suddenly aware their house leaned on it. She sat across from me, and her eyes, which had looked smug months ago, were red. I shouldn't have said that at the wedding, she said. I was stupid. I was trying to look clever in front of people, and She stopped. Knowledge penned itself in. I didn't know about any of this, she added then, as if the admission would lower the stakes. But I could see that she had not been wholly innocent. There were transfers that had wound thinly through the family. Small favors, an apartment paid for temporarily, the kind of favors that, when untethered over time, become expectations. She was contrite and mortified, and to her credit, willing to cooperate. She offered to testify, to help make restitution if any of the funds had passed through her account, or had been used to subsidize her lifestyle, and she could prove receipt. Perhaps out of shame or blind loyalty, her initial impulse had been self-protective. That happens in families. It doesn't excuse the behavior, but it makes the human landscape more complicated than villainy and virtue. We presented Bradley's confession to the board as part of a closed session that protected employee privacy. The board's reaction was a mixture of dismay and the disciplined professionalism required of governance. There was grief, particularly because things had been used in ways that undermined the company. There was relief, too, because the matter was no longer ambiguous. It was mapped out and had a plan. We approved the restitution schedule and the supervision mechanisms. We also approved the governance measures I had proposed. A public set of minutes and motions establishing a family contract policy, a third-party audit for any family business relationships going forward, and an independent HR director with the authority to enforce uniform policies. What I insisted on, and what perhaps surprised some people, was that I did not insist Bradley be cast into permanent disgrace. I insisted on an outcome that balanced accountability with the possibility of rehabilitation. He would not keep a position of power inside the company without proving himself under supervision for a period of years. He could, over time, earn a role that required measurable results and was not based on familial warmth. That was just. It was also difficult. It charged him with the work of learning to stand on his own. When news of the governance changes and the audit leaked to the press, because family stories have a way of traveling outside the confines of meetings, the family narrative shifted into public view. There were sympathetic articles about the difficulties of family-run firms. There was predictably gossip. I handled it the way I had learned to handle other moments of public scrutiny, with clarity and a single narrative focus on stewardship. We released a statement that emphasized our commitment to employees and to transparency. We did not litigate gossip in the court of public opinion. we let the facts stand. Back at home, the dinner table conversation changed. Bradley no longer joked easily. He was quieter and more present in a way that suggested he was listening rather than staging his reaction. He attended counseling. He worked on a restitution schedule that involved part-time employment on the factory floor under supervision. No privilege, only work. The decision to put him on the floor was controversial. Some family members thought it cruel. I thought about the people who had never had a relative cushion them and realized that the discomfort he felt coming into the daily rhythm of labor could be transformative if he allowed it to be. It would not restore trust overnight, but it might teach humility where entitlement had grown. Eleanor kept her distance at first, probably out of a mixture of embarrassment and the protective instinct of someone who had ridden the privileges of our family for a long time. Over months, she made small gestures, attending a company community day and volunteering in a way that suggested she wanted to be useful in the world. She apologized more than once. We had a frank conversation about what had led her to lash out that night. Insecurity, a lifetime of measuring herself against a ledger of comparison, and the particular cruelty that comes from choosing social advantage over family truth. She expressed regret that she had weaponized appearance to belittle someone who had quietly held a whole life together for the family. "Why did you say it?" I asked once, not to be cruel, but to understand. She had looked at me like a person taking off a costume. "Because I was frightened," she said. "I thought, if people know you have power and money, they'll see how undeserving I am. If I could make you small, maybe I wouldn't look small." The logic was terrible and honest. I told her that diminishing someone else never makes you larger. It only makes you meaner. I did not reconcile in a single evening. Reconciliation, when it occurs, is slow work. It requires repeated evidence that a person can hold new habits. I permitted her the chance to engage in the civic efforts the company was sponsoring, charity drives, scholarships, and she responded to the necessity of steady work with a humility that had been absent before. She volunteered to help with the scholarship fund I established for the children of factory workers. It was not a theatrical admission. It was a small, useful act. I accepted it as part of repair. The corporate reforms began to show an impact, modest at first, and more substantial as time went on. Employee satisfaction rose. Grievances were addressed more promptly because employees had a neutral HR director with authority. The rent adjustments were implemented on a sliding scale, with a transition plan that allowed family members living in company properties time to adjust. We negotiated with those who would be harmed by abrupt changes. Some family members signed leases at market rates, but were offered financial planning assistance to prepare. Others took buyouts. The board met regularly with minutes and objective measures. We brought in a chief operating officer from outside the family, someone with the skill to professionalize operations and the temperament to hold to policy without drama. He did not dismantle the culture. He fortified it where it had been weak. One outcome that surprised me was how many of our employees expressed only gratitude for being taken seriously. They told me, directly and sometimes haltingly, that they had felt invisible under the old system because decisions were sometimes taken for comfort rather than merit. The small bureaucratic steps, timely raises, transparent hiring, clear performance goals, restored dignity in a way open speeches never could. Watching someone who had worked on the line for 20 years be promoted to a supervisory role because she earned it, not because she fit a family narrative, felt like a small justice. Bradley, working under supervision, learned details of the company's operations that his college classes never covered. There was nothing romantic about the process. There were mornings when he complained and nights when he resisted the bills of consequence. But he also learned the shape of an honest paycheck. There were days when he came home exhausted and for the first time in a long while, proud in a quiet, good way. The restitution schedule took years to meet, and there were setbacks. He had to liquidate certain assets and accept salary garnishments, and at one point, There was the temptation to run from accountability. He didn't. That mattered more than his initial collapse. Part of my work in the aftermath was also personal. I revised my estate planning with an eye toward preventing a repeat of the dynamics that had encouraged enabling. I restructured my trusts to include conditions for distributions based on demonstrated responsibility, employment, counseling completion, financial planning. I made provisions for a foundation that would carry forward our company's philanthropic work, independent of family control, governed by an independent board. The foundation would provide tuition aid and small business grants to community members, giving back in steadier measures. These actions were not done to punish. They were done to create an architecture of responsibility that did not rely on my temper or whim. A handful of family members were angry. Some accused me of public spectacle. Some claimed I had gone too far. There were barbed lines in the family group messages and the occasional ostranenie in social contexts. That stung, of course. But the sting was less than the knowledge that many others had been given protection and clarity for the first time in years. Power, wielded prudently, does not feel like triumph so much as the correction of a long-running error. There were practical legal steps, too. We filed notice with the bank detailing the forgery and worked with the prosecutor's office to determine the appropriate criminal handling. Ultimately, because Bradley cooperated, made restitution, and entered into a supervised rehabilitation plan that included counseling and community service, the prosecutor offered a conditional agreement. If the restitution schedule was met and Bradley's compliance continued, they would seek an outcome that favored rehabilitation over incarceration. It was not a gift. It was the result of measured, documented steps he undertook to repair the harm. There was, however, a lingering cost. The record would not simply disappear, and Bradley would have to live with the consequences of his choices in ways that would shape his future for years. In the months that followed, as the company adjusted to new governance and as family life rearranged itself, I had an odd feeling of quiet. There was less clatter at the edges. The wedding insult felt less like a blade that could be taken out and waved in the air and more like a necessary alarm that had led to correction. I did not gloat. I did not savor the discomfort of those who had misread me. I felt instead a steady sense that a thing I had been entrusted with was now on a firmer keel. There were moments of personal reflection that surprised me. Walking past the factory on a gray morning when the rain had polished the loading docks, I watched men and women clock in and think of the routines that make life manageable. A predictable paycheck, a scheduled break, a supervisor who counted on them. I thought of my husband, who had once said to me, "If you keep doing the right little things, the rest will follow." I thought of how small acts of administrative courage, calling a meeting, changing a lease, insisting on minutes, had translated into security for real people. Eleanor and I did not become intimate again overnight. We had a complicated history that ran deeper than a single insult, but we cultivated a new mode, honesty without rancor. She apologized publicly once at a company event, briefly, humbly, without theatricality, and she began to support community efforts. She learned, as I had had to learn long ago, that self-worth can't be purchased by the sharpness of one's tongue. There were times when tenderness complicated my resolve. I missed my son in ways that felt like an ache beneath the sternness of my decisions. There were evenings when he would call and tell me about a problem on the line he was trying to fix, and I'd find myself smiling through the worry. Part of the work of being a parent is learning how to love someone enough to let them fail in ways that shape them. It is a hard lesson to teach and a harder one to learn. As for the company, tangible outcomes began to appear in annual reports. Safety incidents decreased after we invested in training. Turnover trended downward as people found reason to stay. There were profitability metrics that improved because contracts were renegotiated and inefficiencies corrected. None of this erased the past, but it did suggest that the stewardship approach I had insisted on was not merely moral theater. It had pragmatic value. I established the foundation with a board independent of the family. Its mission was intentionally modest at first: scholarships for trade school, grants to small local businesses, and a matching program for employee charitable contributions. Eleanor volunteered on the scholarship review committee. Bradley, once he had regained footing, helped in a limited capacity under supervision, an arrangement meant to tether him to service rather than privilege. The most enduring lesson I carried with me, beyond the ledger and the motions and the legal memos, was the difference between dignity and dependence. For years I had conflated saving my family from discomfort with loving them properly. It was a mistake born of a heart that could not bear shame. It had produced in my son a pattern of reliance, and in my sister a habit of comparison and dismissal. Correcting that pattern required rules, yes, but also patience and the willingness to let loved ones do the honest, painful work of growing up. There was a private satisfaction in watching someone who had been aided all his life start to find his measure in the small routine of honest work. There was also a quiet sorrow in the knowledge that the relationship would never be exactly the same. That is the price of reclamation. You trade the quick comforts of enabling for the harder, truer work of repair. And sometimes repair means a relationship different in texture and tone, but steadier for it. Late one autumn, sometime after the immediate crises had settled into policies and schedules, I attended a modest company appreciation dinner. Not the kind of gala with press and flowers, but a hall where workers' families brought casseroles and kids darted under chairs, where someone told a joke and someone else brought a pie. I sat at a long table and listened as people spoke about their lives: children in school, the difficulty of a commute, gratitude that their hours were respected. A woman who had worked in the packaging line for 21 years stood up to thank the company for the tuition assistance program and spoke about how it made her feel seen. I thought then of how small acts of governance had changed daily life for people whose names had never been in our family memoirs. On the drive home, the city lights blurred through rain, and I felt a careful gratitude. Not in the sense of triumph, but in the sense of a ledger balanced not by vengeance, but by steady, institutionalized care. I had been insulted in a room full of flowers and glass. I had chosen to answer not with a spectacle, but with a set of policies that made lives better, and asked for responsibility where it was due. If that night at the wedding had not happened, if the slur had fallen into the air like so much confetti and never lodged, I might still be the woman who privately rearranged trust documents. But the insult crystallized a long accumulating realization. Kindness without boundaries fosters dependence. Dignity without action is hollow. I had chosen to act. There are no neat endings in family stories. Bradley's restitution took years. We survived rough patches. Some relatives remained distant, but the company endured, and the people in it fared better because someone had insisted that governance and care need not be opposites. They can be the architecture of each other. And so I live forward with the small account of what was lost and the larger account of what was protected. I walk past the building some mornings, the sign polished and the lot steady. I think of the men and women who clock in, and of a son who now knows the shape of consequence. I think of a sister who learned that sharp language does not make you clever, only small, and of the quiet work of rebuilding trust. If this story resonates, if you've ever been dismissed in public or discovered that the people closest to you assumed your support as a given, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the messy, human side of power and responsibility. We don't always get it right, but sometimes the measure of a life is not in what blunts us, but in how we set things right afterward.